Thank you. Thank you, Gloria. Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be back and see so many familiar faces and some less familiar ones as well. As the title of the talk suggests, I will be discussing a topic that is apparently familiar to you, Donald Trump. The last time I was here, I talked a little bit about how Donald Trump had put his presidency together, focusing on the White House staff and fitting that in sort of historical context. I'm going to build on some of the observations there, but look more broadly at Donald Trump's presidency and give you a perspective that I think is probably slightly different than what you've been hearing in some of the popular media. As always, I'm going to throw a lot of slides at you, and I encourage you to stop me at any point to ask to clarify slides, or if you just simply have a question, raise your hand, and I'm glad to take questions at any time. And of course, I'm going to try to keep this shorter than an hour and allow us at least half an hour for Q&A. But again, we'll see how these things go. I'm weighed down on one side of the head with headgear. So it's throwing me off. I'm unstable, unlike our president, who is a stable genius in an era of unstable majority. And 1 year in, I've been giving tons of talks. Here I am talking so excitedly to Al Jazeera that I literally fell asleep listening to myself. And I asked them to send me a link, and this is what they sent me. Needless to say, I've been back to Al Jazeera. Rating Donald Trump. In the United States, we like to evaluate presidents. My mentor, a very famous political scientist named Richard Newstad, opens his classic work, Presidential Power, by saying in the United States we like to rate a president. We measure him as weak or strong. We call what we are measuring his leadership. And we do not wait until a man is dead. We rate him from the moment he takes office, and we are quite right to do so. I am, in effect, going to take Newstad's charge seriously and try to rate Donald Trump. Now, if you've been reading the New York Times, I'm not the only one who is doing this. The Times yesterday published a survey put together by my colleagues, political scientists, ostensibly presidential experts. I say ostensibly because you may not agree with these rankings. And what they did was rank each president on a scale from 0, absolute failure, to 100, great. And the rankings probably don't surprise you if you're familiar at all with presidential history or other types of surveys put together. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., for instance, did this for a number of years. So the top presidents are Lincoln, Washington, Franklin Roosevelt. Rounding out the top 10, the usual suspects, Teddy Roosevelt, Jefferson. There are some differences. We did this again 4 years ago in 2014, and if you look at this column, this is the changes from last time. There's a couple of notable changes. Barack Obama was 18th when we first did this in 2014. He's now jumped 10 points to 8th. And so this is the one caution I would give you. It's much more difficult to evaluate current or recent presidents because we're not sure of their legacy. Decisions they made are still unfolding, the implications of that. And so much of our opinion is wrapped up in our own partisan viewpoint. Whereas after somebody's been dead and buried for several decades, we begin to get more of a consensus on their historical legacy, and movements tend to change much less. So if Obama's changed 10, you can imagine how Donald Trump's evaluations may vary 2 years from now or 4 years from now, and so on. Conversely, Bill Clinton dropped 5 slots, and Andrew Jackson dropped 6. Jackson probably because of changing attitudes towards his treatment of Native Americans. Clinton because of, among other things, the Me Too movement. His presidency has been increasingly viewed through the lens of the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Who's not up here? And by the way, this is the top 31 presidents. Anybody missing? Yes. Donald Trump. Where is Trump? Looking. Trump, looking. Oh, Donald Trump. Ranked last by presidential experts in terms of, he's a 12 out of 100. By any scorecard, that's not very good, right? The only other interesting one here, George W. Bush has actually climbed 5. He's gone from 35 up to 30. He's just on the other side. But Donald Trump is my topic today. Is he really the worst president that we've had? I'm just curious, how many agree with that ranking? I am not surprised. I have been giving talks all over Vermont, and a lot of people are sort of nodding. And again, this survey is relatively recent. But the general impression I get in a very liberal blue state is that Donald Trump is not held in the highest regard. We should keep in mind, however, that in other parts of the country, opinions differ dramatically from here. Now you might say, well, of course the presidency scholars don't like Donald Trump. They're a bunch of pointy-headed, tree-hugging, eco-terrorist, limousine-driving, latte-sipping, baby-killing secular humanists, right? And in fact, some of my colleagues are exactly that, but we have a few more on the middle, self-proclaimed independents, and we have even some of those goose-stepping neo-Nazi conservative types as well, right? And their rankings at the top do not differ dramatically. There are some differences. Barack Obama is rated much more highly by Democrats as the 6th highest. Republicans only have him as the 16th. So there's some partisan differences. Independents have him in the middle. Conversely, Ronald Reagan is in the pantheon of great presidents when you ask Republicans, not so much when you ask Democrats. And again, independents are a little more bullish on Reagan than are Democrats. So there are some partisan differences. Interestingly enough, however, Donald Trump is not viewed very highly by Democrats, only an 8. Now, by independents, he beats out James Buchanan, who sort of got us into a major civil war, or failed to prevent that. He's rated slightly higher than Buchanan, behind William Henry Harrison. Interestingly enough, Harrison served as president for about a month, but apparently that month was better than Donald Trump's year. And then even among Republicans, no fans of Donald Trump. They've only have him 40th. Andrew Johnson, impeached, but not convicted. Below him, Harrison and Buchanan and Franklin Pierce. So this is a presidency after 1 year that is not leaving a very positive legacy, at least if you believe my colleagues. But should we believe them? I want to make a more nuanced argument. I want to today suggest that Donald Trump's presidency started off rocky, in part because of circumstances beyond his control, in part because of some decisions that he made regarding who to surround himself with, but it's actually getting better. And I'm going to sort of talk about what I think have some more recent successes and even make the claim that he may surprise some people and turn out to be, if not a Mount Rushmore quality president, at least somebody we should perhaps give a little bit more credit to. Here's sort of the context of my argument. Presidents are inherently weak. This is the argument that Richard Neustadt made famous in his book, Presidential Power. Trump started out weaker than most. And this is in large part because of the political context in which he was elected. I'll talk about that. But it's also the case that he is governing at a time of historic polarization in Congress, which would make it difficult for any president. Abraham Lincoln, Lyndon Johnson, the famous master legislator, to get things through Congress. What it means is you're not going to get any support from the opposing party. If you want to get any legislation through, one measure of your presidential effectiveness, you're going to have to rely on your own party. And it turns out the Republican Party is both in the majority, but also deeply fractured. And Trump is sort of dealing with his own party's fissures and trying to bridge those. And there's a long-term trend here, long-term nationalization of congressional elections, which means essentially this, that you are automatically going to be opposed, not just in Congress, but by much of the public, simply by virtue of your partisan affiliation. The public has become incredibly well sorted in terms of partisan attachment. And we know that anything a president of the opposing party backs will automatically be opposed by roughly half the country. So Donald Trump is not, to be sure, an effective president, but a large reason for that lack of effectiveness beyond his own missteps, which were serious, I think, is the context in which he is governing. And that's basically the theme of the argument today. So I want to say he started out with early missteps. I'll take us through that. I'll talk a little bit about the Russian collusion, the scandals, the things that are unique about him, particularly his role as tweeter-in-chief. How many here are on Twitter, by the way? Excellent. Good. Don't get on it if you're not. There's no need. Stick with Facebook. I'm going to talk a little bit about the argument that he is mentally unfit for office. It turns out, by some psychiatrists' studies of presidential biography, about a quarter of our presidents were unfit for office. And so he's in good company. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll talk about what I think the turning point of his presidency has been, John Kelly's appointment as chief of staff, and then I'll finish up by talking briefly about two recent significant legislative accomplishments, and I'll talk very briefly about the midterm. Okay. Just important to remember, the 2016 election was not a transformative election. We were surprised by Donald Trump winning, but his victory was based on essentially boosting support in 3 or 4 key states. But the overall change from 2012 to 2016 was not that significant. So Hillary Clinton, as you know, actually won the popular vote by about 2.9 million votes. That's almost identical to what Barack Obama won in 2012. Trump did slightly better than Romney, about 2 million more votes, but in terms of percentage, he won only 46.4 compared to Clinton's 48.5. And again, turnout was not through the roof, slightly higher, 60% to 58.6 in 2012. So why did Trump become the president? Because he improved on Romney's performance across the north-central United States, roughly from Pennsylvania to the Dakotas, in particular flipping battleground states of Ohio, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And the reason he flipped those had much less to do with his campaign and much more to do with deep-rooted historical trends that are now dating back 3 decades. And the short answer here is the Democratic Party has been shedding lower and middle-class white rural voters for decades now. That used to be the cornerstone of the Democratic Party. They have been moving Republican. We just didn't know it until Donald Trump happened to capitalize that last bit of movement from the Democrats to the Republicans was enough to flip 3 or 4 key states. That gave Donald Trump the presidency. But this was not an election in which Trump could claim, I have a mandate. I accomplished something that no other Republican president was able to accomplish, at least not in terms of the voting coalition. The United States, in a majoritarian system, small changes on the margins can have major consequences. And that's what happened from 2012 to 2016. So he takes office without a lot of political wind in his sails, and he manages to blow even that. He surrounds himself, and I won't go into detail since I gave a talk about this earlier, with individuals who compensate for his own inexperience by being even more inexperienced than he is. So you have this case of the blind leading the blind very early on. Steve Bannon, a much better media strategist than he was a White House staffer. Sean Spicer was not cut out to be a press secretary. Michael Flynn, of course, turned out to have lied about his contact with the Russians. Reince Priebus had no control over Donald Trump. Trump immediately compounds the situation by listening to Bannon and pursuing this so-called Muslim ban on immigrants from 7 predominantly Muslim nations. He then goes and fires Jim Comey. I'll talk about that in a moment. And then he chooses as his first major legislative initiative repealing Obamacare. Turns out the Republicans can agree on only one thing, getting rid of Obamacare, but they can't agree on what to replace it with. And so that goes nowhere. So here are the major staff departures in his first 6 months. Again, probably the most important one here was Flynn, because it helped contribute to this perception that there was a criminal enterprise taking place here in regards with contact with the Russians. But of course, probably the biggest misstep he made, May 10th, he fires FBI Director James Comey, according to Reince Priebus, who just gave an interview for Vanity Fair. From day one, Trump was looking for an opportunity to get rid of Comey and finally pulled the trigger on May 10th. Of course, this set off a firestorm reaction. I was on VPR talking about whether this was obstruction of justice, and a week later, the Assistant Attorney General Rod Rosenstone appointed Mueller as special prosecutor, practically guaranteeing the Russian story would not go away. Precisely the opposite impact. And of course, on July 28th, the effort to repeal Obamacare comes to a thud as McCain, with his famous post-midnight vote no, thumbs down, and that killed the major legislative initiative of Trump's first 6 months. And at this point, people are saying this is a failed presidency. This guy is a one-term president. His popularity, as I'll show you in a moment, is sinking. This is where I think he makes the most important decision of his first term. He fires Reince Priebus. He brings in John Kelly, moves him from Homeland Security to make him chief of staff. It's not that Kelly has been flawless as chief of staff. In fact, he's made some critical errors, but he has made the trains run on time. He has jettisoned some very weak staff members. And for more or less, he's tried to keep Donald Trump at least somewhat on the same script as everyone else. There's only so much you can do with Donald Trump on that. One of the things Kelly's done is he's fired additional people, some by his own choice. Anthony Scaramucci lasted 10 days. Kelly forced him out. His biggest victory, Steve Bannon, forced out Omarosa. We all know Omarosa from Celebrity Apprentice. And she was director of communications. He resigned. And of course, most recently, Rob Porter. That was not Kelly's doing. Rob Porter was, of course, the White House staff secretary. Crucial, important position. He was in charge of the paper flow. He basically made sure that every memo that went into the White House office was properly staffed out so that the cover memos were attached. Crucial position, and he was forced to resign after allegations of spousal abuse. This turnover is unprecedented. Here we have, this is a study from Brookings put together by a former colleague of mine, looking at the first 4 years of President Ronald Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and now Donald Trump. And you go years 1 through 4, and you can see in the first year, this is the turnover of senior staff. Donald Trump's turnover is by far the highest. So this has not been a very stable White House, a lot of turnover. Now, we might give him credit, or Kelly credit, for recognizing that these people brought in initially were not well suited for working in the White House. But whether we do or not, the point is there's a lot of turnover here, and that, among other things, contributed to the perception of disarray in the White House, and it also cost him a lot of public support, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But I just want to put that in context. This is a study that I've done with various research assistants. This is the percent of individuals retained from 1 year to the next year, going all the way back to 1930, in the White House staff. And the short summary here is if we run a sort of a regression line, there's obviously different fluctuation, but the trend is downward. In other words, White House staffs have become less and less stable. And Donald Trump is simply fitting the latest trend. So again, this is part of my larger argument here. We tend to look at Donald Trump as sort of an entity unto himself, but he is a product of long-term forces that have contributed to the perception that his has not been a very good presidency. One of those long-term forces, the White House staff, has become a much more difficult place to retain individuals, and this is primarily because we tend in recent years to hire individuals who got us there, people who worked with us on the campaign trail. And that's not very good preparation for working in the White House. The things that Steve Bannon did on the campaign trail, that were quite effective at getting Trump elected were not so good helping him work with an opposition party or even with his own party in the White House. All right. The other thing, news media. Partly because of his own coverage, his own actions, but also I would argue, bias may be too strong a word, but the media's preoccupation with aspects of Trump's presidency, particularly his personality, contributed to an historically bad news coverage. This is news coverage based on Pew Research through October of Trump's first year. The orange are negative stories, the green are positive stories, the gray is neutral, and we have, for comparison purposes, a similar study of Clinton, Bush, and Obama. And immediately it becomes clear Trump has 3 times the amount of negative coverage as these prior presidents, only 5% positive coverage. Why is this? Maybe his presidency has been historically bad. Maybe the press is out to get him. Maybe it's a combination of both. Not only does he have negative coverage, but the coverage is disproportionately focused on his personality as opposed to policy. So again, this is the Pew Research. These are stories that focus on leadership and character. And these gray on ideology and agenda. By far, the brunt of Trump's coverage has focused on his personality and his leadership, or lack thereof, right? And again, I'm neither criticizing nor affirming this coverage. I am merely pointing out it is different. He is being held or evaluated on a different yardstick than our previous presidents. This may again be a function of his own tendencies. For instance, he's the first president to tweet. He does so on a regular basis. That may be driving the news coverage. I talk to reporters and they will tell you, for better or for worse, the first thing they do every morning when they wake up, they check Twitter to see what this president did at 3 in the morning the night before. It drives the news cycle. Trump is very much aware of that. That focus, by the way, on personality has spilled over into efforts to evaluate his mental health. More than any recent president, there have been questions about whether Donald Trump is mentally competent to serve. This started in the campaign, November 11th, 2015. A series of psychologists were interviewed and said this guy is a classic textbook narcissistic personality disorder. Right? One guy is saying he's so classic, I'm archiving video clips of him to use in workshops. He's a teaching example. What is a narcissist? Donald Trump is, right? And again, this has spilled over during his time in office. A psychiatry professor at Yale was summoned to Capitol Hill for 2 days of briefings on December 5th and 6th. Not surprisingly, she briefed primarily Democrats. But the question they wanted to know was, is he stable? And her answer is no. He's not stable. He's going to unravel. We're seeing the signs. He's going back to conspiracy theories, denying things he admitted, being drawn to violent videos. Trump, she said, is going to get worse and will become uncontainable with the pressures of the presidency. Wow. Now again, some context here. You really have to be a strange person to run for president in the first place, right? Not everybody thinks that they're qualified to be president. And in Trump's case, there's a lot of talk about invoking the 25th Amendment. That's the amendment that basically says if a majority of the cabinet and the vice president say the president's not fit for office, then he can be removed and the vice president move in. And again, this has been played up big in the press. But Donald Trump isn't buying it. He responded to these charges by saying, actually, through my life, this is genuine Twitter, my 2 greatest assets have been mental stability and being, like, really smart. Right? Crooked Hillary also played these cards very hard. He's right. She campaigned to a far greater degree than any previous candidacy by running on his personality defects, and we saw where that got her. I went from a very successful businessman to a top TV star to the President of the United States. By the way, he did it on his first try. How many previous presidents won on their first try? Oh, wait, practically all of them. Never mind. I think that would qualify as not smart, but genius, and a very stable genius at that. I was tempted to play this wonderful parody song after South Pacific about a very stable genius. I am the... No, never mind. Okay. Well, guess what? According to a study by Jonathan Davidson of Duke University Medical Center, who did not interview all these presidents, but then again, Trump hasn't been interviewed for a psychiatric evaluation. Based on biographical sources, he claims half of presidents have been affected by mental illness, 27% while they were in office, mentally ill. A quarter of the presidents, right? 24% were depressed, 8 had anxiety disorder. Depression included Madison, Lincoln, of course, most famously. Calvin Coolidge slept 10 hours a day. He was so depressed in the White House, particularly after he lost his son. Other anxiety disorders ranging from social phobia to generalized anxiety afflicted Thomas Jefferson, Ulysses S. Grant. Teddy Roosevelt was bipolar, according to this study. Why else would you go to the Amazon for a 2-year expedition? So that's not a sign of being crazy. I don't know what is, right? And of course, we're not even talking about the drinking. We know Franklin Pierce died of cirrhosis of the liver. Grant was once allegedly so drunk he fell off his horse. And Nixon was unable to make a rather important phone call because he was, quote unquote, loaded, right? Again, trying to provide some context here. No psychiatrist that I know of has actually interviewed Donald Trump and done a psychiatric test, but that's not stopping the media and his critics from wondering whether this guy is suited to be president. And it reminds me of a very famous saying from Selena Zito, who was writing about Trump during the campaign. And this is something I can attest to, having attended several Trump rallies and asking Trump supporters about his rhetoric and his language. And they would just sort of say, that's Trump being Trump. Nobody takes him seriously. But the thing is, the press does take him seriously. And his critics take him seriously, and they report everything he says, and they fact check it, and they say, this guy is lying, he's breaking all sorts of norms, he's mentally unstable. You talk to his supporters, and they say, it's Donald Trump. This is what Donald Trump does. He's just trying to get you guys goat, right? So the press takes him literally, but not seriously. His supporters take him seriously, but not literally. And I think that captures a big chunk of it. The problem, of course, for Donald Trump is this media focus on his idiosyncrasies and his missteps and the organizational chaos surrounding his presidency meant that he hit the ground with very low ratings from day one. So what I have here is Gallup poll data asking people, do you approve or disapprove of the job the president is doing for the first year of every president dating back to Eisenhower. So you have Eisenhower, Kennedy, Nixon, and so on, all the way up to Trump. This is the 50, this midline is the 50%. So above that, more people approve of you than disapprove of you. And a couple things you can see. More recent presidents tend to have lower approval than Ike or Kennedy or even Nixon in his first year. Ford's not in there. But the second thing we've seen is a tendency to, in recent presidencies, to go down. William Clinton went down. He got a boost after he passed his first budget and hovered around 50%. George W. Bush was declining slightly until 9/11 boosted him up. Barack Obama's first-year popularity almost exactly tracks Donald Trump's. It just starts about 10% higher, or actually 20% higher. Trump, unlike Obama, never had a honeymoon. Never had a honeymoon. He just started out in the negatives, and he's continually dropped. So he has been historically the most unfavorably viewed president that we have had in the modern era. And this is consistent across all groups. This is the approval rating, Gallup, broken down from January 21st to December 31st, so almost his first calendar year. Each one of these groups, you can see they're ranked from people who really hate him to people who actually like him. But you can see in that period, he regressed among every group except for people who attend church on a weekly basis. They've actually grown to like him a little bit more. But every other group, he lost support except for college grads. He remained stable there at about 38% approval. And so he's not doing well across the board, right? Not doing well across the board this first term. All right, the final problem he's had is he hasn't got a lot of legislation through. Now, I'm going to show you data on this, but one reason, of course, is he's dealing with a historically polarized Congress. So what these measure, the blue is the Senate, dating back to 1879. The red is the House. And what we're measuring here is the distance between the two parties, ideologically speaking. I'm not going to go into how we figure this out statistically, but it's basically comparing the votes of Democrats versus Republicans. You average them together, and you sort of get a measure of where they are ideologically on a scale from -1, they're incredibly liberal, to 1, they're incredibly conservative. The difference between them is what we're measuring here. And what we see is that difference has grown increasingly distinct, so that now we are in the most polarized Congress we have had in the post-Civil War era. So if you're Donald Trump, you're elected to the White House to do something. We don't know what you want to do because you didn't really run on a fixed agenda. You take office, you don't have a mandate. You immediately surround yourself with inexperienced people. You get negative press coverage that's inordinately focused on your mental shortcomings. The public increasingly grows disillusioned with you. And you look across down Pennsylvania Ave to a Capitol in which half the people from day one are not going to vote for you. So you have to rely on your own party, and it turns out your own party is very divided as well. What I'm trying to say here is this guy has not done very well, but he's not been in a position to do very well. This is a very difficult time to be President of the United States. And let's skip that one. So this is another way of looking at that. This is the Senate. Each one of these is a Republican, red. Each one is a Democratic senator, blue. And we've arrayed them again ideologically from liberal to conservative. And where are you going to build a bipartisan coalition? You are not. There is no middle ground, right? Same with the House. There is no middle ground. And so what does this mean? It means, for instance, if you want to measure legislative productivity, this is a very crude measure. It's just the amount of bills you've signed into law in your first year in office. Donald Trump has so far been the least productive of presidents, despite having a Congress controlled by his party. That's not to say presidents before him were all that productive. Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and George W. Bush, compared to, say, John Kennedy and Dwight Eisenhower. Now, this is a crude measure, because it just does not differentiate between the importance of the law. But the point here is he's not getting a lot through Congress, even though the Congress is controlled by his party. And it's because we're going to skip that. Okay. So it's been doom and gloom, but I want to say a couple of things, and then I'll sort of put this in a larger context. One is he's actually achieved some pretty significant legislative victories in the last 2 months. First, and by significant, I don't mean that you necessarily agree that they were good things. But whether you agree with them or not, they were major legislation in terms of having a big impact. One, fundamental tax reform, passed on almost a straight party vote, 51-48 in the Senate, the House 227 to 203. 12 Republicans from California, New York, and New Jersey voted against it. No Democrats voted for it. They could afford to lose those Republicans because of their margin. Of course, these Republicans are voting against it because It eliminated state-based deductions that are huge in these high-tax states. And then more recently, a bipartisan spending bill that raised caps on both domestic and military spending. This passed both the Senate and the House comfortably with Democratic support. So it was the first major piece of legislation of the Trump era that actually attracted Democratic support. And there is enough momentum here that they're beginning to work now on immigration, and DACA. We'll see if they continue to have some successes. But these are major, and I'm not going to tell you what the tax bill does. If you want to know what the tax bill does, we can go through it, but I'm not going to. But the important thing is it's grown increasingly popular. While it was being debated, it wasn't very popular, because Americans don't like watching the sausage being made, and they didn't like the bitter partisanship. But now that it has passed, it's settled in. Some of you are actually seeing your paychecks a little bit bigger, and we can see the number of individuals who strongly or somewhat approve from December through now. The most recent poll has gone up among Republicans, but even Democrats are warming up to it. Now, not a lot of them are, but it's gone from 8% approving to 19%. Put another way, those who strongly or somewhat disapprove, Democrats were at 90%. In December, they now have dropped to 79%. So this is a bill that has provided a little boost to Donald Trump and the Republicans. He's accomplished something. Can he build on this momentum? Skip that. Skip that. That's the details of the bipartisan budget bill. We don't need to know that. He's also beginning to get some credit from economists over the various aspects of the economy. Now, how much credit he should get is a matter of debate, but here's a survey of economists from last month. Strong green means Donald Trump is rated strongly positive on his handling of these issues, all the way to strongly negative. You can see, at least if you believe economists, he is viewed as somewhat or strongly positive on all of these, contributing to the stock market. Now, notice the survey was taken before the last 2 weeks, so they may have changed somewhat on that. GDP growth, we're at about a little over between 2 and 3%. Job creation, again, it's been a steady long-term increase in jobs. And so the question is, can he take advantage of this relatively good news about the economy heading into the midterm elections, right? And part of the problem Donald Trump has had, when I try to sort of apportion blame for why he hasn't done better, part of it is he steps on his own message. His White House, John Kelly, says, why don't you just tweet about the economy? Just do that again and again and again. But no, he has to talk about little Bob Corker or Lion Nancy Pelosi, or he has to brag about whatever he's bragging about. But notice, if we extend his approval ratings from December 31st, which is what the previous chart showed you, to today, his popularity, this again, each one of these is an individual survey. And what we're doing here is just sort of aggregating them all to do an underlying trend. The red is the number of people who disapprove of him. And the black is the number who approve of him. Look what's happened. He bottomed out at about the beginning of December. Then he passed the tax bill, late December. He passed the spending bill. His approval ratings have gone up 6% over the last month and a half. People are actually warming up to Donald Trump. He's at 43.6%. That's about where Obama bottomed out early in his second year. So again, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but you'd rather be trending this way, up, if you're Donald Trump, than trending the way Barack Obama was, which was continually down through here. All right, last topic. So what does this mean? We've got a midterm coming up. Historically, we know if there is one thing that is as sure as the swallows returning to, wherever the swallows return to, Capistrano, okay, it's that the president's party will lose seats in the first midterm election. And this is both in the House and the Senate. Franklin Roosevelt was an exception, but every other president that lost seats until you get to Bill Clinton in 1998. That was the Monica Lewinsky. And George W. Bush in 2002, that was the 9/11 impact. But think about Barack Obama, his first midterm. He lost 63 seats. Historic drubbing. Lost control of the House. And then in 2014, he lost another 13 and 9 Senate seats to lose control of Congress, right? So if history holds, Donald Trump's ability to get things done through a Republican-controlled Congress may be coming to an end, right? Democrats need 24 seats to regain the House majority. Over the last 21 midterm elections, the president's party has lost an average 30 seats in the House, 4 in the Senate. Again, only 2 of those have they gained seats. Those were under special circumstances. The Monica Lewinsky election in '98, the 9/11 election in 2002. So if you're a Democrat, you're cautiously optimistic. You just have to get 24 seats. That's, forget this. And the other thing that is important, when we think about midterms, increasingly midterms are referendums on the presidency. This is a statistical analysis that I put together with research assistants. Essentially, it tries to measure the relative impact of local forces on a House election versus national forces. I'm not going to tell you how you sort of parse these out, but the bottom line is this. The black line, solid, is the influence of local forces. So what I'm saying is when Peter Welch runs for re-election in 2018 as the representative from Vermont, how much of your vote for Peter Welch is a function of what he's done here for Vermont, and how much is driven by my attitudes towards the Democratic Party as a whole? Increasingly, it's the latter. In particular, it's my attitude towards the president, right? And we can see this dotted line is the national component. Beginning in 2006, not surprisingly, George W. Bush's post-Katrina election, and where he lost control of the House, national forces have outweighed local forces. If this trend continues, 2018 is going to be a referendum on the Republican Party and Donald Trump, right? And the same thing in the presidential, we don't care. We're not going to even worry about these things either. We won't worry about that either. Okay, and in the Senate, Democrats need to pick up 2 seats to go ahead 51-49. Remember, they're right now, they're at 51-49, 2 seats behind. Not all the Senate is up in 2018. So what we have here is, these are solid, means they're not up. And again, I'm sorry, solid, they're not up. The lighter ones are the ones that are up. And some of them lean Democratic. But notice, these light ones that are covered with orange, these are states that Trump won. So although they may be leaning Democratic, they are states that Trump won in 2016. So it's not a sure thing that the Democrats can pick up those 2 seats. In fact, one of the things they have to worry about is there's 32 Senate seats up for grabs in 2018. 23 are held by Democrats. So they have to hold all their seats and pick up 2 of the 3 toss-up seats that are vulnerable Republicans. So there's no guarantee they're going to regain the Senate, but it will be close. There are some early signs that are positive if you are a Democrat. First of all, retirement. These are the number of retirements as of January 9th. 29 sitting Republicans have said they're not running for re-election, 15 Democrats. So that helps. I'm not going to talk about gerrymandering, but this recent court decision in Pennsylvania, in which they redrew the district lines, is probably going to help Democrats maybe pick up potentially 6 more seats in Pennsylvania alone. That would be a quarter of the way to 24. Notice the number of people retiring is a good barometer of a swing election. So here's how many have retired so far. The only other time we had this many in recent memory was in 1992, and in the next year, 1994, that was when the Republicans retook the House. So high retirements, particularly from one party, are usually a sign that members can see the handwriting on the wall. Their internal polling tells them it's time to get out before they're booted out. So that's a good sign for Democrats right now. But John McLaughlin is a pollster who is one of many pollsters who has something called the generic Congressional Ballot. And as Donald Trump so gleefully tweeted out yesterday, that generic Congressional Ballot has the Republicans beating the Democrats. What is the generic Congressional Ballot? It's a simple question we ask people in the 2018 midterm. Are you going to vote for the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate? We don't ask them specific candidate, just the party affiliation. Turns out this is a very reliable predictor of the actual midterm. Trump, of course, is citing this one that has more people saying they're going to vote Republican. The reality is actually most of the generic ballot right now is favoring the Democrats. 41% to 36% for the Republicans. But that too has tightened. That difference is less than 5% now. It was closer to 9%. You can't really see this about a month ago. What's changed? Taxes. Tax bill has been a huge boost for the Republicans, and this spending bill that sort of ended the threat of government shutdowns, at least in the foreseeable future. So the Republicans are reaping the benefits of these legislative victories. Is it going to be enough to withstand that historic pattern in which they lose seats? Here is a model. We have wonderful forecast models. This is by Alan Abramowitz. This is the generic ballot difference. And based on that, the predicted popular vote for the Democrats, and based on that, the number of seats they will gain. And based on current seats, that would be the total number. So let's go back. Here's the gap. Anyone do the math for me? It's about 4.3%. Let's go to our chart. 4.3%. Put you right about here. You go over. You're going to gain between 24 to 25 seats. Is that enough to get a majority? Yes, it is, by like 1. So we are right on the cusp here of the Republicans losing their majority. It could go either way. The trend lines, hard to tell. Retirements say Democrats. Trend lines on generic ballots say Republicans. A lot can happen on the remaining months, not least DACA. If Republicans can get one more legislative victory through here, that may be enough to sort of inoculate themselves against the midterm loss. All right, there's also this. I'm not going to talk about the details, but you all know Robert Mueller has just indicted 13 Russians for collusion. Is that good? Is that bad? Depends on who you listen to. Donald Trump says, see, didn't indict any of my people. I'm home free. I would be less confident if I was Donald Trump, but that might be me. So we don't know how that's going to turn out. Donald, of course, is tweeting, see, the Russians were successful in creating discord, disruption, and chaos. They're laughing their asses off in Moscow. Get smart, America. I think he's right. The Russians have succeeded in creating discord and disruption. It's just a question of whether the Trump people help them or not. All right, I want to finish with a big picture. How are we doing here? Okay, good. I got 3 minutes, and I'll make my hour deadline. We are in a unique period in American history. Again, I wanted to step back. I've sort of taken you through sort of this very hasty overview of the Trump presidency. I want to put it in historical context. And I want to make the argument that Donald Trump is as much a symptom of the time we live in as a cause. And by that, I mean we live in a historically unstable time. By unstable, I mean the public, you, knows what it doesn't like, and that's the two major parties. But they can't make their mind up on what they want to replace those two major parties. And so what we have seen is a period of flip-flopping across different governing configurations to a degree that we have not seen since the Civil War What do I mean by this? Think about a very simple rule of thumb. R stands for Republican, D stands for Democrat. You can have a government that is, when you think of the House, the Senate, and the President, is controlled by one party, RRR, all Republicans. Controlled by the other party, DDD, all Democrats. And then there's various permutations. President of one party, the House of the other, the Senate of the President's party, and so on. You see what I'm saying? Logically, you have 8 different configurations that are possible, right? Now, if you go in the era of, say, 1896, that was a realigning election, McKinley, Cross of Gold, and all that stuff, through 1930, the beginning of the Great Depression, we see an era of, broadly speaking, Republican dominance. They control the presidency except for that unusual 1912 election. That was when Teddy Roosevelt bolted, ran as a third party, Bull Mooser, split the vote, and it allowed Woodrow Wilson to come in. That's the only time the Democrats were able to win election. In 1912, he won re-election on the promise to keep us out of war. Otherwise, the Senate, the House, and the presidency were controlled by Republicans for that entire period. That's a period of stability, right? One party, stability, dominance. Then things were reversed. From 1932 to 1952, again, a realigning election, the Great Depression. Republicans are thrown out as the laissez-faire party. Roosevelt comes in with his New Deal coalition. They dominate. The only way the Republicans are able to break the presidential lock is electing a war hero in 1952. And there's one brief period where they're able to hold on to the Congress, and that lasts exactly 2 years until the Democrats. Another period of stability. Now there's a third period. This is from Eisenhower through the end of George Herbert Walker's. Now here we have a different type of stability. Here we have a presidency that's closely competitive. Eisenhower replaced by Kennedy, and then the Republicans come in. There's a brief interlude there with Carter, sort of the post-Watergate fallout. The presidency tends to be Republican in this period, but the House, always Democrat. And except for a brief period with Ronald Reagan, the Senate is always Democratic. So this is a period of institutional stability, but it's a different type. It's a stability of divided government. Congress, Democratic, President, more or less Republican. 3 different eras, 3 different illustrations of stability. Now look at the current era. We start in 1994. That's the period when Newt Gingrich contract with America. For the first time in 40 years, the Republicans take over the House. Look what has happened since then. Presidency. And again, I haven't included 2016 here because I couldn't fit it on, but you could do the math. That's a Republican, Republican, Republican. So we've had presidency that is pretty much split, slightly Democratic, a House that is pretty much split, a Senate that has been pretty much split. There is no stability at all. We seem to be oscillating from configuration to configuration to configuration. In fact, of those 8 configurations I outlined logically, we've gone through 6 of them since 1992. This is a period of revolving majorities in which the public increasingly says, a pox on your House, throw them out, and we'll try the other guys. And then after 2 or 4 years, throw them out. We're going to try the other guys. Since 1992, the country, I'm quoting Morris Fiorina, the country has experienced an era of unstable institutional majorities. The Democrats have held the presidency for 16 of 24 years. That's now 16 of 28 if Trump survives. Neither party has held office longer than 8 years in the presidency. The popular vote margins have been incredibly narrow. Even one re-election, Obama was the first president in recent memory to actually win re-election by a smaller margin than his initial election. He was getting less popular. Republicans have had an advantage in the House, but Democrats have won majorities twice. Control of the Senate has been evenly split. 6 different patterns of control. Think about this. Every time somebody comes up with conventional wisdom and says, this is what's happening, we throw a wrench in them. So in 1992, Ross Perot won 19% of the vote, kept Bill Clinton from breaking 50%. That was the strongest third-party performance we've had in decades. Didn't win any electoral college vote. 2 years later, Democrats lose the House for the first time in 40 years. 1996, Clinton wins re-election, but so do the Republicans. 1998, for the first time since 1934, the Democrats, the president's party, actually gained seats in the House. First time in 6 decades. 2000, chaos. We still don't know who won the presidency, right? We're still debating that. 2002, once again, defying history. Bush's party actually gained seats in a midterm, probably because of 9/11. By 2004, Karl Rove is confidently predicting we have had a realignment. Republicans are going to dominate government for the next several decades. It's the McKinley era all over again. Right? Almost. He lasted 2 years. 2006, the Democrats suddenly come back in power. There's this Republican thumping. 2008, Obama is elected. Remember, demographic trends are all favoring Democrats. They were going to dominate government for the next decades. Almost. Lasted 2 years. Republicans came back into power, right? The Democratic shallacking. And now, 2014, they lost the Senate. We don't know what's going to happen. So what we have is an apparent increase in macro-level instability, not seen really for over 100 years. And this belies the stability of voting patterns. That is, we know people are increasingly well sorted in the Republican and Democratic Party, and they're voting straight party tickets. But enough of them at the margins are switching their vote to just totally overthrow the majorities on a regular basis. And the reason, of course, is because when you vote for a straight ticket for president, senator, and the representative, and you've essentially installed a party that is guaranteed to govern to its base. And most Americans are not happy with either party. And so after 2 years of watching the country lurch leftward, they throw them out. And 2 years of watching them lurch rightward, they throw them out, right? And they are searching for that happy medium. Neither party is giving it to them, because the parties are consistently running very traditional liberal or very traditional conservative. This is where Donald Trump, I think, is the key. People cannot understand why Donald Trump got elected. Donald Trump got elected mostly because after roughly 2 decades of this, the public said, forget it. I'll try anything different than the same old that both these parties. Jeb Bush, are you kidding me? Hillary Clinton, are you kidding me? We've done Clinton, we've done Bush. I'll take anything. I don't care if it's a former celebrity game show contestant who has documented mental problems. I'd rather try him. That's what Donald Trump is. Donald Trump is a symptom of a political system whose members, you, are fed up to a degree that we have not seen in this country since the post-Civil War era. Okay? And I'm going to stop there. The consequence here is unstable majorities, right? Trump is much a symptom of political instability as he is as a cause. And what does this mean? It means brace yourself. He's the front runner for the 2020 presidential election. I was going to wear my Make America Great hat again, which is made in China, but I'm not. Let me take questions, if you have them. And I got to wait till microphones get to you.
You a number of times use the word control when it comes to either the House or the Senate, and the media has as well. But the fact is that control in terms of the agenda and control in terms of the votes in the Senate in particular may not really be as simple as has been described, because many of the things that have to pass in the Senate don't require a simple majority, but they require 60 votes. Could you speak to that, how that influences all of the partisanship and the ability to get things done?
Sure. So, not surprisingly, you're absolutely right. I probably should have used the word, instead of control, I should have used the majority to describe the situation. The Republicans have a majority, but as we saw in their effort to repeal Obamacare, they certainly don't have control, right? Their own party, 3 of their moderate members, Murkowski, Collins, and John McCain, defected. it's not surprising that where they have passed significant legislation, they were able to do it under something called budget resolution. It's a parliamentary procedure that only applies to certain types of legislation dealing with the budget and money, and it allows them to pass legislation through the Senate with a simple majority as opposed to a supermajority, which is the case with most non-economic or budgetary related issues that the Senate deals with. If it doesn't have a budget component, you can't use it under this budget resolution process, and that means you normally need 60 votes in order to invoke cloture, prevent a filibuster, right? So you're absolutely right, and the reason I didn't mention it is because the particular bills that they passed under the special parliamentary procedures in the Senate, it allowed the Republican Party leadership, Mitch McConnell, to pass these without a supermajority. But you're absolutely right, on many issues he cannot do that. And that means the Senate has become a graveyard for a lot of bills. Remember, the biggest difference between the House and the Senate, simply speaking, the House is designed to empower the majority party. Paul Ryan more or less can get anything he wants through the House if he can keep the House Freedom Caucus together. That's sort of that conservative portion of the Republican Party of roughly 36 individuals. Think about the Tea Party movement, who are sort of fiscal conservatives. But on most issues, he can hold his party together. But you go to the Senate and things, all bets are off, right? This is why we've had problems with immigration. We're getting an immigration bill through the House. We can't get it through the Senate because it doesn't fall under these budgetary resolutions. Great question.
I'm afraid that people are going to look at this last slide and they're going to say Matt Dickinson is telling us that Donald Trump is odds on to win in 2020. I don't think that's what you meant to say. And I don't think, in fact, that you could say that any incumbent president was not odds on to win at this point in his first term. So what I really want to know is, in this unbelievably unstable time which you've so wonderfully described, why are you so sure that, or are you so sure, that Trump isn't going to fall all over himself to the point that he's not even going to be close to being odds on for 2020?
Well, you're right. Any projections about 2020 right now are should be taken with a large dose of salt. There's a huge amount of uncertainty involved. We don't even know who the Democratic candidate is. There may be a Barack Obama out there who will burst onto the national scene between now and then and steal a lot of his thunder. This is just simply an empirical regularity. It is very difficult to defeat an incumbent president. Historically speaking, incumbent presidents tend to win re-election. There are exceptions, Jimmy Carter, obviously, George Herbert Walker Bush, but for the most part, incumbent presidents tend to win re-election for all sorts of reasons. They tend to have an advantage in name recognition and fundraising. They can use the perks of office to push an agenda that is popular and so on. Now, you might say, well, Donald Trump is not all sorts of presidents. He's not your typical president, and you're right. In many ways, he's unique. But who are you going to beat him with? I mean, part of my argument here.
Until after 2018.
Well, right. So we're not in 2018. So right now, if you ask me who the front runner is, it's Donald Trump. Okay. That's all I'm saying here. Invite me back in 2 years, and I'll actually have a forecast model for you that was very good in 2016. It predicted Hillary Clinton would be the next president, as you recall. Yes?
About 10 slides in, you had a horizontal axis showing all the Democrats on the left and all the Republicans on the right, no overlap, social conservatives versus liberals. Liberal economics is Adam Smith, and it really aligns to the Republican historically anyway. So it's always very confusing when we just say liberal versus conservative. Are we talking about economic policy, or are we talking about social policy, as in, controlling women's bodies? That somehow that's a conservative point of view, and liberals would not take that point of view. Could you describe a little bit about the methodology?
Sure.
What liberal versus conservative means here? Because I was so surprised that there's no overlap.
So, great question. So, the way this is devised, two political scientists named Keith Poole and I think it's Harold, last name Rosenthal. What they've done is they go back to the very first Congress. We have a record of every vote of every member of Congress dating from 1789 all the way up through the current 115th Congress. And they're able statistically to array each individual relative to the other individuals, looking at all their votes. They squeeze them on a dimension that goes from -1 to 1. And they can sort of put them there, -1 being, you know, you're somewhere left of Bernie Sanders, and 1 being, you know, you're a good friend of Attila the Hun. It's a little more complicated than that, but what they have discerned is if they use a statistical technique that tries to explain the votes that each individual member of Congress has made, and they infer that there's an underlying dimension that drives that vote, that explains. So you have talked about, for instance, the economy. It turns out you can pretty much explain, with the exception of race, which is a separate dimension, from 1789 through now, there's essentially one dimension that determines how people vote. And broadly construed, that dimension is your attitude towards the relative role of government in our lives. If you believe that government has a minimal role, you are what we call today a Republican. In other days, you might have been a Whig. The party name has changed. If you believe the government has a much greater role in our lives, not just economically, but socially, you're generally considered to be a liberal. So that's what that is measuring. It's basically tapping into this underlying dimension. Now, in periods in history, there's been a second dimension that occasionally has played a separate cross-cutting role. Race has been a big one. But race now has gradually aligned with that original dimension so that people who are liberal on race tend to be liberal on everything else. People who are conservative on race, conservative on everything else. So that's the methodology that it's getting at. Now, it doesn't fit everything. You might think, well, Rand Paul is kind of an economic libertarian, and he's different than a social conservative. But in general, Rand Paul tends to be closer to the Republican center of gravity than he is to the Democratic center of gravity. That's what that's measuring here. There's a second dimension here, which you're getting at. This is a social, racial dimension. Sometimes that has an independent impact on whether one calls oneself a Republican or a Democrat. It turns out in recent years it doesn't. It lines up exactly with this. So if you are liberal on this dimension, what you might call social, something about abortion issues, you tend to be liberal on economic issues as well. So this is not liberal in the classic liberalism of the 19th century, which I think you're referencing, sort of laissez-faire liberalism dealing with free market economy. No, this term refers more broadly to, do you support a greater role for government in our lives or not? And that's what this is breaking down on.
What you just said is what I was thinking and why I asked to get the microphone. I think that there's relatively little in comparison to years ago loyalty to a party, but it's more an ideological outlook that determines how we vote. But there are these strange circumstances. The fact that Donald Trump really has been a Democrat, or at least claims to have been a Democrat for most of his life. And here we have him pretending at least to be a Republican. I don't know whether he has any ideology except Trumpism. And that the only reason that he's president is because he's not Hillary Clinton.
I think that's an accurate description. The point I would make is one of the things we're struggling is Donald Trump moving the Republican Party in a particular direction, or is the Republican Party moving Donald Trump? He campaigned as a much more economic nationalist or populist than he's actually governed. He's really governed as an orthodox Republican, and that may be recognition that if you're going to get anything through Congress, you have a Congress dominated by orthodox Republicans. So, you know, there's some tension there. The Republican Party does not like him, but he's their president. So they kind of have to work with him. And he's sort of recognizing, as far as I can tell, what Donald Trump believes in is winning. He just wants to win. And the Republicans right now have the majority, and they say, here's how you're going to win. Back our legislative agenda. He has made hints about, well, for instance, today he came out with signing an executive order eliminating bump stocks, which is a mechanism that allows you to turn semi-automatic weapons into automatic weapons. That's not going to sit well with the NRA, maybe, maybe not. So, you know, he makes noises about being a more moderate infrastructure. He's talked about, I've got this infrastructure, but is he actually going to get an infrastructure bill through Congress? Probably not, right? So, you know, he campaigned is much more of a, and I was at his rallies, and a lot of his applause lines were not strictly conservative applause lines. Socially, he apparently has been as much of a Democrat on issues like abortion and gay rights than he has been a Republican. So he's not a classical Republican. And again, I think that's a sign of the times, that the public was willing to take a flyer on a guy who did not fit neatly into either party.
From the last two legislative accomplishments of President of the Republican Congress, it seems pretty clear that the size of the national debt is not nearly as important as we all thought it was. Do you believe that Paul Ryan can accomplish anything in the way of cutting back entitlements? And good, he talks about that all the time, but does he really have clout over the House to bring a bill like that?
And if he does, so the question was whether entitlement reform, we know that the current rate of spending of the entitlement programs is probably not sustainable. The problem, of course, is even if Ryan is able to hold his coalition together, and it's a big if, any entitlement reform under the current configuration is going to die in the Senate. And you mentioned the deficit. Again, the big impact of this bipartisan spending bill was raising these caps. These caps that had been imposed by the Republican Party in 2011 is the price for sort of passing a budget. It was a deal they struck with Barack Obama. Well, approximately 80 Republicans who had voted for those caps in 2011 voted to raise them this last month. Why did they do that? Because Barack Obama was no longer president, Donald Trump was president. Partisanship is a strong drug, and they were willing to abandon their sort of fiscal conservative principles when it meant a victory for their party. Now, in their defense, that was the price they knew they had to pay to increase the caps on the military. And this is sort of a consistent Republican refrain, we need to raise those caps. But, you know, consistency has not been a strong suit of the Republican Party. Rand Paul fought all of 3 hours to shut the government down as a deficit reduction, but even he voted for the tax cuts, which contributed to the deficit.
Well, more so, Corker voted for it.
Yes.
Yeah, they gave you a little something.
Yeah, well,
Can I ask you something?
you have the microphone.
How important is the national debt? Maybe you can.
As a political scientist, I'm going to punt and say, ask an economist about the national debt. I mean, the deficit and the debt are issues that we are constantly told, oh, the deficit, it's so large, it's going to eat up all private investment, people are paying off the national debt, they don't have money for private loans, and yet the deficit has gone way up. I mean, I will say this, if you're a classic Keynesian economics, tells you do not increase the deficit at a time of a growing economy, job growth. You don't do what the Republicans just did. So it doesn't fit with the classical economic model. Politically, it made a lot of sense. I've actually talked to very liberal Keynesian economists who think, you know, this actually wasn't a bad idea. We kind of want to overheat the economy because job growth has been so tepid and so sluggish. This will move us from 2% GDP to 3.5%. So there's kind of an irony here where very, very liberal economists are sort of agreeing, not necessarily with the mix of where those tax cuts went, but the idea of running a deficit. They're actually more comfortable with that than sort of orthodox conservative Republicans are. But I'm not going to, I mean, you know, I'm reminded of the Harry Truman famous statement about it. He just wished he had a one-armed economist because he was sick of his economic advisors saying, well, if you do this, on the one hand, this might happen. On the other hand, that might happen.
I just watched a documentary on Harry Truman.
Harry Truman, yes.
And the 1948 election.
What's that?
On the 1948 election,
Yep.
everyone picked Dewey. Even Truman's wife believed Truman was going to lose. I don't know of one pollster that got 2016 right. So, your opinion?
So well, first of all, I think I gave a talk here. Did I give a talk here that sort of said, unless something unusual happens, Hillary Clinton is going to win this? And I showed you some forecast models. Here's the tricky thing about this. Actually, the polls, the national polls, were quite accurate in 2016 in predicting the popular vote. They were actually more accurate than they were in 2012 or 2008. They were very accurate. Where we were let in, I would say, in defense of my political science forecast models, if you recall, I said Hillary Clinton was going to win about 51% of the popular vote. I was right. She won 51% of the popular vote. Where we got in trouble is in trying to predict the Electoral College vote. In 2012, we got it completely right. We predicted it every state correct. And we did it based on state-level polls. Now, we've always known that, in contrast to national polls, state-level polls are a little dicier because there's not as many of them, and some of the outfits running them aren't as particularly good. So what happened in 2016 is our polls were off in key states, particularly Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And that's what threw our models off in our forecast. But nationally, the popular vote was fine. Now, here's the problem if you're a Democrat. The problem with Democrats is they live in the wrong places, right? They live on the coasts. They're this nice little Boston to DC corridor, and then over there, San Diego to LA to San Francisco corridor. That's where all the Democrats live. So they're wasting their votes when it comes to allocating the Electoral College. So we can get the popular vote nationally quite right. But translating into the Electoral College becomes a little trickier because we have to poll, you know, those farmers in Wisconsin who are living out in the sticks, and we have to make sure that we adequately poll them, and it's a little more difficult to do so. So I guess I would say it's easy to blame the pollsters in 2016. They actually were pretty good at the national level on the popular vote. It's just that we don't elect presidents with the popular vote, and this is a problem Democrats are increasingly having to deal with.
Realistically speaking, in light of what's been happening in the last week or so, how much effect do you really think the Russian intervention had on our election, especially since we're talking about the Electoral College?
Yeah, so nobody knows. Our best guess, and I say this as somebody who has done extensive research on the impact of campaigns on voting. So let's assume the Russians spent $1.25 million a month, which it appears, at least in September, they did, if you believe the indictment. And they did that to do a number of things. They held some phony rallies. They posted social media stuff. The one thing you need to keep in mind, that amount of spending, which seems like a lot, is less than 1/6 of 1% of what the two candidates spent on the presidential election. It was dwarfed by the candidates' spending. The second thing is we know that the independent impact of campaign type advertising on social media or television, that is the ability to sway somebody's vote. That is, somebody who might be inclined to vote for one candidate sees this social media ad and says, I'm going to change my mind. It's almost non-existent. People don't change their mind as a result of the advertising. Now, one of the reasons they don't change their mind is because there's counter-advertising. So both campaigns are sort of bombarding them, and it's sort of a net wash. So when we've done studies that have tried to estimate the independent impact of campaign television advertising, the independent impact seems to be zero. It has no persuasive impact whatsoever. So, you know, my priors, based on the research and the amount of money spent, is probably the Russians had no impact at all. Now, if you want to come back and say, well, if 70,000 votes switched in 3 states, Hillary Clinton would have won, and how can you tell me they didn't switch 70,000 votes? I can't tell you you're wrong. On the other hand, our forecast model, before I knew the Russians were involved, said Hillary was going to win about 51% of the vote. She did. So the final point I would make is, I don't think Hillary Clinton ran a particularly good campaign. She didn't go to Wisconsin at all in the last couple of weeks. She spent an inordinate amount of time focusing on Donald Trump's mental stability and personal issue, rather than running on an economic record that her predecessor quite correctly could stand on. And she didn't do any of that. What we tend to forget is Donald Trump ran an equally horrible campaign. Think about his debate performances. Do you remember his debate performances? He was a walking disaster. And his Billy Bush audio. I mean, this was not what you want to have a presidential candidate have released. So there's Comey here, Billy Bush there. All a long way of saying there's no evidence that I know of that, without thinking about the Russians, would tell me somebody should have done better than they did. I think the election turned out, in terms of the popular vote, pretty much how I would have expected it turned out. So I don't think the Russians had any impact on this. That is not to diminish the seriousness of someone trying to influence an election. Can you imagine if the United States went around trying to destabilize regimes and influence elections? Oh, wait. Yeah, never mind. We've been doing that for decades. Another topic, sorry. You get my point, right? It's easy to win conspiracy theories here, and I can't tell you you're wrong, or the people who think the Russians made a difference. I just don't see the evidence for it.
Yeah, when the economy is good,
Yep.
you stay in power.
Yep.
When the economy goes down,
Yep.
you're out.
Yep.
It seems that we vote with our pocketbooks.
We do.
We don't vote with what's in our head. And I can see if an economy is good, you're going to stay in power.
That's absolutely right. I mean, if there's a single rule of thumb in our economic forecast models, it is the party in power, rightly or wrongly, tends to get rewarded when things are going well, tends to get punished when things are going poorly. For reasons that we can talk about, the president is held up as sort of the manager of the economy. Again, I think that's probably overstates his impact, but this is, again, one of the reasons why we think Hillary Clinton probably ran a poor campaign. She didn't maximize the advantage she could get from a growing economy in 2016. One of the interesting things is Donald Trump's approval ratings are actually lower than what we would think if you looked at the economy alone. We think it's partly because he's just been too stupid. Wrong. He has been too easily swayed by tweeting about peripheral things rather than just honing in on the economy. And the question is, in the run-up to the 2020 election, again, assuming we don't go into an economic tailspin, will he see the light and begin to focus on the economy? If so, I think that's one of the reasons why I put him as the front runner with all the caveats that we talked about.
I never wanted to root for an economic downturn.
But now, just a minor one. We just need a small downturn.
But my question is, you talked about the disconnect between popular vote and electoral vote and outcomes. And would you talk a little bit about what's going on right now, both with the various court decisions on districting and redistricting, and the 2020 census?
Sure.
And where do you think this may lead us?
Sure. Great question. So again, you're sort of following the news. Pennsylvania State Court, there was a suit. The judges in Pennsylvania are elected. They're largely a Democratic state court. Democrats brought suit arguing that under the state constitution, the way that district lines had been drawn by a Republican-dominated legislature was violation of the version of basically of equal protection. Because it basically said if you're a Democrat, your political rights were being abridged in terms of electing people who represent you because of the way these lines were drawn. This is a novel argument, and I think a lot of people said this is going nowhere. But the state Supreme Court bought it and said, you're right, this is a violation. The Republicans appealed to the Supreme Court, and they said, this is a state matter, we're not going to deal with it. Of course, the Supreme Court is dealing with its own issue of a similar claim of a couple of states that brought suit in the Supreme Court, arguing that by its nature, partisan gerrymandering, which has gone on for 200 years, is a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, basically saying we are violating the rights of individuals on the basis of their partisan leanings when we allow state legislatures to draw lines in ways that increase the likelihood that one party's representative is going to be elected as opposed to another. Well, the Supreme Court has struggled for decades on other types of gerrymandering based on race, for instance. But it has never found a problem with partisan gerrymandering. Now, evidently enough justices are concerned about how lopsided this gerrymandering has become to decide this might be actually a constitutional issue. The problem they're having is, what do you replace that with? What is a neutral redistricting? What is fair? Because we don't have proportional representation in this country, right? There is nothing in our laws that say if in a state your party wins 50% of the vote, you should get half of the seats in Congress. There's nothing that says that. So it's going to be interesting to see how the court comes down on this, because this will have huge implications. As I already mentioned, just the Pennsylvania decision alone boosts the likelihood of Democrats picking up seats by maybe another 4 to 6. Well, they only need 24 to regain the House, so this is a major victory for them, assuming the Republicans can't reverse it. They already went to the Supreme Court once, and the Supreme Court kicked it back to them. But there's a broader issue here, and this is, we tend to overstate the role that gerrymandering has played in ensuring a Republican majority. And it gets back to the same issue I talked about with the Electoral College. And the issue is this: Democrats clump up in urban areas. Republicans do not. Why is this a problem? The problem is if you want to draw districts and say you believe districts should be of relatively the same size, and they should be compact and contiguous, and they should recognize boundaries like county boundaries, and they should also be fair. Well, you can't do all those things simultaneously, because think about New York State. New York State it's a blue state. Do you know why it's a blue state? Because a bunch of people live in Manhattan. That's it. So they win House races in Manhattan 95-5. You go up to upstate New York, though, the races are much closer, but Republicans win. So how do you make a district in New York that's fair? Well, you might have, let's see, a block in Manhattan and then run it up to the Canadian border. You see what I'm saying? So a lot of what we perceive to be partisan gerrymandering is residential gerrymandering. It's the fact that Democrats just aren't distributed as efficiently as Republicans. So the dirty little secret of the Pennsylvania ruling, that nonpartisan state Supreme Court, they went out of their way to help Democrats. That was the only way that they could make it more fair, by leaning towards the Democrats. And that's really the problem you're facing if you want to fix gerrymandering, because Democrats are not efficiently allocated. So the only way you're going to increase their representation is you've got to consciously draw districts that advantage them. Weird districts, right? So this is the struggle the Supreme Court is having. It's easy for us to say partisan gerrymandering is not fair because by design, the idea is to elect more members of one party than the other party. Okay, I agree with you. How do you fix it? What's the standard that replaces that we believe is fair? That becomes really difficult. It becomes a difficult issue, and I'm fascinated to see what the Supreme Court is going to. Now, whatever they rule, it's only going to impact the next 2 years, and then we have the census in 2020. We do it all over again. But there'll be new criteria for drawing lines on the basis of this court ruling. So stay tuned. That is a huge court case that's going to come down this summer. Thank you very much. I appreciate everything. And I'm glad to talk outside if we have time.